Thanks everyone for joining us after morning tea, and this is the nice air-conditioned room, so really happy to be in this one. We've got an incredible panel today, so I will start quite quickly so you can get as much time and experience out of them as possible. My name's Michaela Sargent, and I'm CEO of Exemplar, which is a disability inclusion and health managing contractor working across the Pacific and Timor-Leste. So I'm very excited that they announced the disability inclusion strategy yesterday, and really excited that we've got incredibly passionate advocates for disability inclusion on the panel today. So our focus today is on some really innovative research that's come out of many of our programs that are particularly focused on disability. One of those is actually looking at disability inclusion within the legal system, which of course is where a lot of people with disabilities are even further marginalised and traumatised often. And it's certainly not set up in many countries to support people with disabilities. Our speakers today are Mohamad Doddy Kusadrianto. Mohamad's Director of the Law Program at the Asia Foundation Indonesia. He has more than 15 years of experience working on this subject, particularly focusing on access to justice, human rights, legal drafting, corporate governance, competition law, business and trade law, and with a special focus on international development. Our other speaker today will be Eko Riyadi. Eko's Director for the Centre of Human Rights, studies at the Islamic University of Indonesia, and he's both an advocate as well as a technical specialist on disability rights in Indonesia. And you'll often find him delivering training directly at the source to court staff on ensuring services for people with disabilities in the legal system, particularly focused in the court system. They'll be talking today about the Australia Indonesia Partnership for Justice program. It started in 2017 and was a 5-year investment by DFAT. Under the fourth pillar, the corrections reform, they focused on police, courts and correctional services collaborating to enforce rights and uphold the rule of law. And one of those in particular was the reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities in the correction system. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion on mainstreaming disability issues in prison reform work and the experiences and lessons learned from the Australia Indonesia Partnership for Justice. Thank you, Mohamad and Eko.
Thank you very much, Michaela, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present our work in this distinguished forum. I will probably start first with the, sorry. So can I just click this or, yeah, okay. Okay, I'll start first with some sort of like background, why we are actually focusing or starting to work on the disability issue, mainstreaming disability issue in prison reform program. Because since the start of the reform era in 1998, Indonesia has sort of like has a big problem in terms of overcrowding situation in our prison system. So it creates a lot of problem because to date, the number of prison inmates in Indonesia, prisoners, is actually already exceeding 100%. Because of the way the criminal justice system working, they have much in favor to the imprisonment instead of alternative sentences model. So this has become a big problem for us, and it has sort of like infringed the human rights principle. Because as you may know, prison overcrowding creates situation where you cannot actually live in a proper way within the prison system. So according to our data, basically, in September 2022, there has been 276,000 inmates in Indonesia. While this will likely increase in the future if we don't have any intervention to reduce that number. This extraordinary situation makes it difficult for Director General of Corrections to basically work and promote better services to inmates, including to the disability people and the marginalized groups, basically. And the Asia Foundation, actually, with support from the Australian Indonesia Partnership for Justice, has been working. Actually, we have the APJ has been sort of like a long-term program from the Australian government. It was started before in around 2010, and then it has been extended continuously until this year. And then the first time we worked on disability issue actually in 2012, where we got funding to support disability people organization, or DPOs, and where we try to strengthen their capacity in many other areas. Many areas basically, so including, for example, on providing legal aid services. Now, in IPJ2, we try to be much more focused because we have been investing before with the DPO, so we're trying to basically introduce DPO and connect DPO with the criminal justice system. Our main target at this stage is actually prison. Why prison? Because prison has a lot of they have a lot of dynamics within, and they actually have been kind of forgotten by criminal justice system because they are at the end of the what do you call it? The chain of the criminal justice system, and people often forget that. So it's actually created opportunity for us to focus and to give more support to them because they don't know what to do, and it's a good start for us to work on this issue. Now, if we talk about disability issue, I'm sure some of people here from Indonesia knows that there has been quite significant change in the past 10 years, especially with the ratification of the Convention of CRPD, the People with Disability Convention. And then in 2016, actually, we have a good momentum because of the enactment of disability law. This is the first time Indonesia actually recognized disability issue as part of important element in public services. So the way government perceive disability changed from social into kind of empowering. So this is the thing that why 2016 disability law is very important. Unfortunately, Australia has a new strategy that started in 2015 as well that focus also on disability rights. So it creates momentum for us to basically promote the disability issue in a prison system. And from us, actually, because our concern is actually the prison overcrowding needs to be resolved. So this is something that we need to handle. People will probably say that why we have to basically detain or imprison people with disability, because you should have alternative imprisonment model, or there should be a way to basically create another system that could basically respecting the rights of people with disability. Now, we've actually tried to start with the assessment. So we kind of start with stakeholder assessment to identify parties or actors that can be supportive to us or that can be a blocker to us. So we start to doing this kind of informal assessment, and we find at least 4 important players. DGC, the first is DGC. DGC is Directorate General of Correction. It is the what do you call it? It is the echelon 1 or the institution under the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. DGC is actually the one who responsible in managing prison in Indonesia. So they are the one who issue policy and issue kind of guidance to the prison officials in Indonesia. So DGC plays important role in advocating disability issue from our perspective, from our initial assessment. The second actor that we've identified is actually the Regional Office of Ministry of Law and Human Rights. As a national body, Ministry of Law and Human Rights has an arm length in each of province in Indonesia. Now, we need to work with them because they can have authority to issue their own policy for their own region. So it's a good trial for if you want to do a pilot project. So we start with the identification of this MLHR, the Ministry of Law and Human Rights Office at the Yogyakarta, basically, at our focus at the time. Now, the other players that we are also thinking is important is actually Bappenas. Bappenas is the National Development Agency. our main counterpart, they're the one who issue the midterm development planning. So it's important for us to engage with Bapanas. And for our own perspective, it is important actually the role of CSOs and DPOs. Our investment before under APJ1 has been a kind of great investment for us to basically leverage that and trying to basically connect the CSO and DPOs with the government official, especially with DGC. And this is why we think we need to focus on this area. Next. Okay, I will hand over this to Eko. He's the director for Pusam UAE, the Human Rights Center in UAE. So he's the one who will present on the research baseline. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mas Doddy. I am the director of Human Rights Study Center at Islamic University of Indonesia, located in Jogja. It's around 1 hour by plane from Jakarta. We got support from EIAPJ through the Asia Foundations to accompany the Directorate General of Corrections to develop the services to persons with disabilities. And the program until now is still running, and what I would like to present today is a baseline study that was conducted in 2018. Yeah. The baseline study was conducted by my center in 2 provinces, Yogyakarta and Lampung. Yogyakarta represents the region which has fairly highly levels of economic development and education, plus the existence of strong civil society organizations, including there are a lot of disabled people organizations there. And Lampung, by contrast, was selected to represent the opposite situations. The study conducted among 3 types of institutions in Indonesia, which are rehabilitation services, detention center, and correctional institutions. The key findings of our baseline study at that time, 2018, is that on rehabilitation services, we found the lack of perspective in social rehabilitations and mentoring process. So the study found the social rehabilitations and mentoring processes fail to take the disability aspect into account. The weakness applies to both the standard operating procedure and the standard of reporting format. The big problem is also happen when the client of rehabilitation services is mental or intellectual disabilities, because usually they are always acknowledging a person with disabilities in terms of physical disabilities. Okay. Due to the absence of appropriate procedure and resources, the social rehabilitations report process requirement assessment of client by psychiatric hospital. Unfortunately, hospitals are unwilling to provide diagnosis as there are no funds available to pay them for the client observations they conduct. Consequently, it is difficult to convince investigators, prosecutors, and judges that a client has a mental or intellectual disability to the lack of medical evidence available that proves this kind of situations. The second finding is the lack of knowledge and engagement with DPO. Actually, the rehabilitation service has a mechanism to collaborate with witness and victim protection services. In Indonesia, we have the law on this. Also with youth protections and rehabilitation centers, legal aid organizations, non-governmental organizations, and so on and so on. But the problem is that mostly the collaborations with other institutions outside of rehabilitation services is only run using the normal perspective without giving any special attentions to the persons with disabilities. The second findings is about detention center and correctional institutions. The first finding is that persons with disabilities are usually identified physically and using medical approach, like the conditions of their hand, feet, or eyes, and from usual behavior, and from the presence of lack response when spoken. The situation is influenced by the standard identification forms that is issued by the Directorate General, that must be completed for new inmate and which requires information on disabilities. This practice is supported by the National Institutionalization Procedure, which recognize only two, let's say, two standards. Number one is inmate with physical disabilities, and the second is inmate with psychological disorders. This model has implications for the actions officer, who say that they always prioritize the medical actions. So they would like to, they always involving polyclinic, social services, psychiatric hospital, and so on and so on. If detention center staff lack of medical capacity to prove the treatment, so the problem will happen. The second finding is the standard of normality and security based of building design. Physical and mobility infrastructure are built to normal and regular standard. Sorry, I use the term normal because it's to describe the situations that usually there is no universal design that is intended to persons with disabilities. Standard accessibility facilities such as ramps, handrails, tactical pathing are not available. All spaces are designed solely for people without disabilities, including the data collections, cells, public room, rehabilitation room, and places for worship. The third finding is I used undesigned effort to serve inmates with disabilities. Undesigned effort is used to describe the effort made by officer to maximize anything that exists there, to provide better services to prisoners with disabilities. Effort of this type are generally a matter of personal directions, although officers often have no other choices but to make such undesigned effort due to a lack of appropriate facilities. The findings, number 4, is correctional institution bear the burden of dealing with inmates with disabilities. Could you please, oh, sorry. Yeah. Sustained during law enforcement officer. The study of my center found that quantitatively, the figure is very significant. We have 70% of persons who are physical disabilities because of the actions of police officer when arrested them. In one correctional office in Lampung. So 25 out of 36 inmates with physical disabilities injured, broken legs because of shot by police officer there. This is very shocks data that we found in Lampung, but the situation in Yogyakarta is different. But I think that it is not common, but actually in rural areas, usually we can find the situations like this. So I will turn to what have been done by my institutions to develop the situations. Number one is improving database system module to include feature on assessment on inmates with disabilities from registrations until treatment or rehabilitation process. And then the second is establish and optimize disability unit services. So we ask the Correctional Directorate General to establish disability unit services all around correctional office in Indonesia. And also we did training on disability perspective for correctional officer. So the policy advocacy on the disability issue that we have been doing until 2 or 3 years is focused on support to establishment of disability service unit, because we have so many correctional office in Indonesia, so it's a long way to go to make sure that all correctional office have the perspective on, and also developing services to persons with disabilities. And the last is support to improve data-based system for inmate with disability. It is also important because when we have data about person with disabilities that is inmate or prison in a correctional office, and then they can develop, for example, program, and then budget, and so on and so on. Okay, the last one will be about, we have key challenge that we face. Number one is staff rotations. It is hard to be faced because when the staff replaced, so we have to start from the first by giving a new perspective and so on and so on. So we need a lot of effort to make sure that the new staff will be always running through our program. Number two is administrative adjustment and budget, because of the correctional office, they have their own standard of budget and administrative things. It is also the key challenge. And the third challenge is about conservative mindset. As Mas Doddy just now said that in Indonesia, before 2020, before 2016, persons with disabilities are seen as persons with impairment. So it is hard to solve this kind of, it is a long way to solve this kind of mindset. Okay, lesson learned will be presented by Mas Doddy. I hand over to Mas Doddy. Thank you, Mas.
Okay, quickly on lesson learned actually, because our program is actually trying to address from policy level up to the how we could actually influence the advocacy at the CSO level. So what we have learned actually from this process, we have tried to do a kind of piloting level at the national level through our colleague here from Pusam UE, and then to promote change at the national level, it is necessary to start with the best practices first. So we kind of show to the national level officials that it's working. So why not you actually try to do at the national level? We can do small if you want, but that's something that we are offering to the national level officials. And the second, database advocacy. I think this is something that we've been, doing all the time in development work. Data is important, and with data we can actually convince the government. Okay, look, there are around, I think at the moment, 3,000 2,000 inmates basically with disability in all prison in Indonesia. So they also need some kind of services, and then this is something that the government should also take responsible on. The third one is champion. So we have to find champion within the organization. Fortunately, at the time we found a good, we can say good, because she's the first woman as the Director General of Corrections. So she was our champion. Okay, stop. Thank you. So at the end, meaningful participation of CSO. I think that's important because we want to make sure that the our input is actually considered and follow up. Thanks. Sorry for the long time.
Thank you, Echo and Mohamad, and that was excellent. We're going to save questions for right at the end because we have quite a packed day, but that was fascinating and I have lots of questions on that data. Our next presenters will be online, so we will be just double checking if we've got any communication issues, but I would like to introduce Dr. Saba Mebrahtu Habte. She's the Evidence Building Advisor at World Vision Australia. She's got over 20 years international development experience, leading designs, management, monitoring and evaluations of large multi-sector nutrition programs across Africa and Asia, focusing on health and nutrition outcomes for children, girls and women from vulnerable communities. And that certainly includes women with disabilities. She works really closely with civil society organisations, government and private sector on these. She has a PhD in population and development and focuses on socioeconomic determinants of child nutrition. And she also has a Masters of Science in Nutrition, Food Science and Biology. So thanks for making me feel a little bit inadequate there. We also have online Viktoria Midelauri. She's the ANCP Education and Disability Inclusion Advisor at World Vision. She has the background in planning and delivering capacity building programs for projects and programs with partner organisations to build disability awareness, disability rights and the understanding of disability mainstreaming approaches. She's a skilled, trained lecturer in inclusive education, disability rights, disability awareness, disability inclusion across all development programming. She also has a degree in clinical neuropsychology as well, so that's very handy with the area that you work in. Prabani is also online. She's the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Lead at World Vision Sri Lanka. Welcome, Prabani. She's a feminist human rights defender, so already close to my heart. Thank you, Prabani, with a really strong focus on gender equality, diversity and social inclusion. She's got a bachelor's in social work from the National Institute of Social Development and her master's in human rights and democratisation at the Faculty of Law from the University of Colombo. She currently is working as the technical specialist on GEDC at World Vision. The topic of their discussion today will be on the case for disability inclusion in economic development, value for money evaluation of gender and disability inclusive economic development project in Sri Lanka. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Michaela, for the kind presentation and also for giving us this opportunity to share our presentation. Viktoria will first present the background of the project design. She was there at the beginning and she's got a wealth of experience on the project from the beginning. And then Prabani will give us the country context, and I'll focus on the design of the study and the findings. Over to you, Vika.
Hello, everyone. It's Viktoria speaking, and nice to be here. And I have just 3 minutes to briefly present how we get there and how we designed the inclusive project, which we briefly call I-Live project. So starting from the global statistics, which is according to WHO, it's up to 15% of population having different types of disability, meaning that there are quite a number of community members that often are excluded from the projects because we don't design them in an inclusive way from the beginning. And also knowing that there is a huge evidence that says that disability and poverty is a big cycle, which is very difficult to break. Disability can lead to poverty because the exclusion from work, education, or healthcare also higher expenses of their participation and inclusion to different services. This can lead to poverty, and poverty itself can lead to disability. So we decided from the beginning of the project to design economic empowerment project in a way that will include and empower and bring income to the lives of people with disabilities, so they can break this cycle of poverty. And very briefly, I will touch theory of change of the project. We from the beginning we decided to have twin track approach to gender and disability inclusion, meaning that we will be focusing to increase access to all project activities that was designed to increase income for vulnerable groups, and on the other hand to empower vulnerable groups and increase their agency. So first outcome was to increase income through developing local value chains. There was a assessment done of which value chains will be most effective in the target communities, and with consultancies with women groups, people with disability, and other vulnerable groups. Groundnuts, mushrooms, and ammoniac was selected at the beginning to start with, and also the project focused on establishing and empowering savings groups so community members who don't have access to some funding can collect money and fund their startups. Also later on, value addition centers were established, and across this process, targeted outreach was happening along the I think first 2 years of the project. It was intentionally done. I can say from home to home, from household to household, identifying vulnerable groups, people with disability, and trying to reach as diverse groups as possible. On the other hand, the second outcome of the project was to increase agency for vulnerable women women with disability as well. Few models were selected to tackle the needs and empower. One was journey of transformation, which was about decision making and recognition within the households, and community change, so-called sea change model, which was tackling negative social and gender norms. And those approaches at the end of the project proved to be very effective to increase agency for vulnerable women. And a project was pushing forward women on leadership positions, which was a lack for a few years at the beginning, and giving leadership training and encouraging women to be on the leadership positions. These similar interventions were done for the outcome 3, which was focusing on increased agency for people with disability. And here we also did a lot of leadership trainings. We worked directly with organizations of persons with disability and invested a lot in capacity building and also promoting people with disability on leadership positions, for example, for mentioned savings groups or producer groups, other community groups that are making different decisions in economic development initiatives. And at the end, the last outcome was focusing on learning. We wanted to capture as many learnings as possible along the way, and also engage vulnerable groups and people with disability. Starting from design, we did numbers of consultations and workshops to design in a participatory way the 5-year project. They participated in data collection, implementation of the project, and reflection and learning process as well. The project was, yes, next slide, please. That's okay. Implemented with, let's say so, huge consortium. It was very innovative for World Vision, and we seek for the support for other international organizations. 3 INGOs were involved, which are CBM, Value for Women, and Equimondo, supporting CBM was supporting disability inclusion, Equimondo was supporting gender aspect. Also, we partnered with market actors, government and private sector, and local CSOs and NGOs. I also already mentioned local organizations of persons with disability. We ended up partnering with 10 organizations of persons, local organizations of persons with disability. I think Prabani will take the floor and explain better the context of the project. And have a nice day. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and it's great to be here and present about the project and the finding. So I will give a bit of where the project context. So the project was implemented in 4 districts in Sri Lanka, and the operations, the project implementation started in 2016, and it ran for 5 years, which ended up in 2021. And we also had 8,101 direct project participants who benefited from the project, and also 12,473 indirect beneficiaries of the project. I will give a bit of the data of the country context and why we thought of design such a project in an inclusive manner. So if we look at the gender inequality rate, Sri Lanka has dropped 14 places and now is in 116 out of 156 countries in the gender gap report according to 2021. And also there's 4.4% of total population age 5 years and above who has a disability. But when we look at the project locations, which is the northern and eastern provinces, the 5 districts that the project ran, the disability rate of the people with disabilities are higher than the national average, which is 8.7% because of the 30-year civil war that was highly affected in the northern and eastern provinces. Also, people with disabilities, especially women with disabilities and other vulnerable groups, women-headed households, are either unemployed or engaged in unskilled or informal sectors for their income generation, which put them in a higher protection risk. Also, people with disabilities have limited capacity to reach for support, and in terms of they have to face many barriers linked to their agency, especially in making decisions where they have to tackle harmful social norms, plus other gendered norms and rules as well. Also, the system itself, sometimes the value chains or the market systems in itself is not inclusive or gender responsive for the people with disabilities to link as producers, employers, or consumers. The opportunities and resources for technical skills, soft skills, or leadership, the skills related has also been a disadvantage for them to engage in income generation actively. We will now go for a few testimonies that we have gathered. Seruvila is a participant, a disabled participant who benefited from the project. He explains that the opportunity he got from the project has changed his life, and also he feels that people, the society now accept, respect and trust the people with disability, and it has helped them to grow and given open for so many opportunities. Kosala is 27 years old. She's a mushroom producer. She's also a saving S40 member who's a saving for transformation saving group member, and she's a treasurer. She's an example who has been trained in leadership trainings and also taken up leadership positions as well in organizations for people with disability. She was not aware actually whether that she can be part of such social groups or social platforms, community platforms, and take up such leadership roles. So through the trainings, being part of the project, she understood the strength and realized how community value her and the role of this people with disability plays and their capacity as well. To give briefly give some inputs about the current context of the country, Sri Lanka is currently going through its worst economic crisis, where the recent rapid assessments have shown that 73% of households have reported of a negative impact on their income. Most of them have lost income, or the income has been restricted in many ways, and 78% of their income is spent on food, or also 70% of the household had reduced their food consumption because of the ongoing economic crisis. So through the project, we have seen that the assessment that we have done on S40 and producer groups of how the economic engagement have given them resilience, we have understood that the project has contributed in several angles, especially on organizing vulnerable groups and mobilize them in savings and strengthening their investment capacity to start up or to expand their income generation. This has indeed helped them to build resilience to different crises that may affect their livelihoods and day-to-day activities. This has given the groups potential to improve and build their resilience to cope such tragedies, and with respect and with dignity to cope such crises. Now I hand over to Saba to give a brief on the research and the findings. Over to you, Saba. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabani. Yeah, so I'll go over the purpose of the study, why we conducted the study, and the iLife project was considered a model project for us to do the twin track approach. And there was a call for an understanding of what it costs to do disability inclusive programming well. There was and to fill the gap on evidence on the overall program cost and achieving disability inclusion. And there was a demand for that from the key partners as well as within World Vision. In terms of the limitation, this study was intentionally generic to inform World Vision's global costing estimates, and it doesn't offer programming models, and it doesn't include private sector and sector engagement and income leveraging. So what were the key research questions? We organized it around the overall cost. What does it cost at the programming level, and what are the benefits? And we used the value for money principles, the 4E, in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, economy, and equity. The methods we used, mixed research methods to gather both quantitative and qualitative data, and it was complemented by the end of the project evaluation, which was conducted from April to November 2021. And it was conducted by a core working group from World Vision Australia, as well as Sri Lanka, in conjunction with the evaluation independent team. And the analysis used the data that was available at that time to stay budget expenditure for the first 4 years of the project. So I'll just highlight the main findings of the evaluation. So overall, the project had met its goal, achieving increase in total annual household income by of 29%, and highlighted also the key achievements of women's economic empowerment, which was one of the main focus of the project, around economic advancement of women, access, agency in terms of decision making, and equitable system. In the interest of time, I won't read all of this because I think the report link is also available here for people that are interested to read more about the brief. So the evaluation summary has been presented in a summary in an impact brief. So what were the key learnings from the evaluation? That the twin track approach was successful in achieving holistic gender equality, disability, and social inclusion, and should be scaled up. And the combined approach of the subsector and interventions, the value additions, and then and where women and people with disability could benefit, and integrated activities to promote JETSI had a key transformative impact. And one of the lessons learned is that the project could deepen its engagement with a broader set of community members, particularly large-scale market actors at the national and at the provincial level, although it was effective of strengthening market actors at the district and to some extent provincial level. The evaluation recommended to do that, for longer term expansion in future. So what did we find from the disability inclusion cost in terms of project costs? It was 22% of the total share budget. So we also did the costing by categories of costing, and found that the capacity assessment that was, the budget that was invested into the capacity assessment was useful in informing the capacity building strategy, as Viktoria highlighted, of the organizations for people with disabilities, and then also the needs on reasonable accommodation to fund for that. One staff was dedicated for disability inclusion, and then training was provided to the other project staff to mainstream disability inclusion. And then the M&E support was also, extra effort was made to ensure that there was a level of disaggregation to be able to inform quarterly reviews and annual reviews of the project to track its progress. In terms of the marginal increase in cost per beneficiary, when we compare with the cost, assuming that the disability inclusion was not included, versus when we included the cost, the marginal increase was at 12.6% per beneficiary. In terms of efficiency, we also looked at comparing other projects that were ongoing at the time that were funded by DFAT for World Vision. The meta review had estimated disability inclusion at 2%. So the project, for the data that we had 14% increase. So that's with a total, with the 22% of total project spend. We're able to see 500% increase in disability inclusion, which was quite encouraging and can be considered efficient, highly efficient. And by the end of the project, the project continued to increase disability inclusion and achieved 19% at the end of the project's implementation. And the analysis also looked at the return on investment, which was estimated at 1.3 for 3.8 return on investment, so that for every dollar invested, there was a return of 3.8, while with the marginal increase of 12.6%. Beyond the economic benefits, we also looked at, the transformative changes that the people with disability experience in terms of their, their ability to speak confidently, to be able to make decisions, and community members, feeling comfortable to work with people with disability, and then also their time allocation, particularly for women with disabilities, increased dramatically by 223%. In terms of equity, I think what came out clearly from the study was that the project itself made a deliberate effort to ensure that the project staff were inclusive. So, including mobilizers, facilitators, and volunteers, there were 23% of those that were people with disabilities, and then 64% of those were female. So this gave them the credibility to speak with authority and legitimacy to advocate for and to champion disability inclusion across the partners and then the government partners, and also found that there were systems in place to ensure that the economy principle was in place. What were the main recommendations? So I think the study concluded that along the line of the end evaluation, that the twin track approach is worth of investment, and with the 22% of project spend is money well spent, and it can dramatically increase engagement of people with disabilities and enhance benefits, and it's recommended for its replication. But there was also areas which needed more attention. Although there were significant improvements in agency of people with disability, only 31% of people with disability saw positive change in the way that the community treated them. So it meant that more effort is needed to improve entrenched community practices and the poor treatment of people with disability. And we also felt that going forward, a comparative assessment of the benefits as well as the costs of exclusion can inform advocacy efforts and policy efforts to strengthen that, and then also include intersectionality with gender and poverty, because as Vika highlighted, there is sort of like a cycle, a vicious cycle between people with disability and poverty that can, that argument can be strengthened, and particularly women feel the double burden of discrimination of being both women and people with disability. So I think in future studies, we would also be working to look at the intersectionality between disability, gender, and poverty. Thank you for your attention, and I've also included the link for the brief for people who are interested to learn more about our study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saba and Viktoria and Prabani. That was fascinating. And that return on investment, I can't wait for us to ask questions about that, but also the lessons learned on intersectionality. Thank you very much. Our next presentation is on rethinking disability data in humanitarian shelter response. And for those of you that attended the DRR conference in Brisbane this year, you'll have known that disability inclusion was a key component for all discussions at that conference, which was fantastic. Many of you might not know that people with disabilities are up to 4 to 6 times more likely to be left behind or abandoned during evacuations, during disasters and conflicts, because they're not involved in the preparation and planning. They also face inaccessible facilities and services and transportation systems when they're trying to leave an area. A lot of shelters and refugee camps are not accessible, and sometimes they're even turned away because they're considered too hard or have complex medical services. So I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Alex Robinson. He's Head of Disability Inclusion and Rehabilitation at the Nossal Institute for Global Health. He is a DRR expert in the region at an international policy level. He was co-founder of the Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction Network that played a lead role ensuring disability inclusion at the Sendai Framework for DRR 2015 to 2030. And we discussed that in great detail at the DRR conference. Alex also has a PhD in development studies with a focus on issues around inclusion, risk and resilience within this sustainable human development. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you. Excellent. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngung Awal people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people in the room. First off, thanks for coming. Great to see so many of you here. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago when we would have had trouble kind of getting half the amount of people in this room to be coming to disability events. So, I'm taking this as a huge plus. I think awareness of disability inclusion is increasing. There's genuine interest in the topic, but a lot remains to be done. We're still struggling to operationalize commitments. We're now at the midpoint of the Sendai framework that was mentioned, and also the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, with those commitments to leave no one behind. So that, if you like, is the context for this presentation. I'm going to present at quite a high level. So I hope, although I'm talking about data, which I know is of interest to some people in the room, there'll also be things which are of interest to people who are more generally interested in disability inclusion. So this research was funded by ELRA, which is a UK-based funding agency through their Humanitarian Innovation Fund. And apologies, but our partners for this can't be here today. And I was supposed to be co-presenting with Leanne Marshall from the Australian Red Cross, who is their shelter lead. And also Abner Manlapaz, who is the director of Life Haven Centre for Independent Living, based in Manila. And Abner, unfortunately, couldn't make it today either. So with that in mind, I'm not presenting from the shelter side. I'm not presenting in terms of lived experience. I'm presenting as an applied researcher who also conducts advisories and technical advisory on disability inclusion. Now, discussions of disability data generally begin and very often end with discussion of the Washington Group. Now, the Washington Group will be familiar to many of the room, and there's some experts in the room on the Washington Group questions as well. But just to give you a quick overview, the Washington Group was established in 2001 to solve this critical issue within disability data. And that is, how do you get standardized and comparable data to compare prevalence figures between different countries and also differences in opportunity and participation between people with and people without disability. To do that, the Washington Group have established a series of question sets. The most well-known is a set of 6 questions called the short set. And these are designed to be used by the non-specialist. They avoid issues of stigma by not mentioning disability. And they use activity limitations as a proxy for disability. For example, do you have difficulty walking? Do you have difficulty hearing? Do you have difficulty seeing? Do you have difficulty with self-care? Now, the Washington Group questions originally designed for use in government have now been widely adopted. They're used in a whole range of programming situations and contexts. So there's also been a long history of guidance and advice on disability inclusion in development and humanitarian programming. We could perhaps call this a canon of disability inclusive development. And we've heard some of the previous speakers talk about some of these key principles. The first is partner with organizations of people with disabilities, OPDs, ensure that we're engaging with people with disability in our work, that we're listening, and that we're also acting on the feedback that we hear. This is fundamental. This has to be done. The second is the twin track approach, and it was really encouraging to hear the previous speakers hear that they had success with using that. The twin track approach, again, has been around a little bit longer than the Washington Group questions, over 20 years now. It involves mainstreaming disability inclusion across programs, alongside targeted and specific interventions to empower people with disability to participate in those programs. What we often find is that programs struggle with the twin track approach, struggle putting it into practice. It's a great idea, but it can be quite hard to take that conceptual idea and actually implement it. And finally, the third part of our canon is collect and use disability data, and particularly disaggregate the data that you have by disability. And this often gets reduced to use the Washington Group questions in many cases as well. Now, these are not, I'm a bit reluctant to make the clear distinction between development and humanitarian work, but there is probably an argument for that. But this is also reflected in the humanitarian sector as well. We have inclusion guidelines, we have standards now, which really reflect these same principles as well. Turning towards shelter and the built environment as well, we also have specific guidance that has been produced by disability stakeholders to improve disability inclusion in shelter and settlements programming. This generally follows principles of universal design, that is, to design goods, services, and in this case, infrastructure, that can be used equitably by all people. And within the shelter sector, the guidance that we have is very often focused on physical accessibility. We know that accessibility is much more than just the physical side, but a lot of the guidance out there is focusing on physical access. On the slide, there are 3 pictures. 2 of those pictures, these are all taken from guidance produced by disability stakeholders. The first one shows a very low-cost ramp that could be produced. The second shows a more complex or sophisticated ramp. It turns around a corner, it has handrails. And the third one is a picture illustrating the width of doors needed for a person who uses a wheelchair. So that is the background. So turning to the research itself, I'm not going to go into the methods. As I said, it's going to be a very high-level overview. The research was called PADIS, or its long name, which was Preparing Actionable Data for Inclusive Shelter. It was in 2 components. The first part was really to understand what are the disability data requirements of humanitarian shelter professionals. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The second part, which was conducted in the Philippines, was really understanding how can we use and make available pre-existing disability data in an emergency. So how can we provide that and use that information with first responders? For example, administrative data that might be held by government. So the first part was we conducted a Delphi panel. We had preliminary interviews. We had a series of 3 Delphi rounds, which were based on a couple of scenarios. And also some validation workshops at the end. The members of those panels were members of the Global Shelter Cluster and specifically their working group on the inclusion of people with disability in shelter response. The first thing that we really wanted to kind of get to understand was, okay, we've been talking about disability inclusion in humanitarian action since the 80s. Okay? Why are we not making that much progress? Why are things not moving forward? And one way of trying to understand that is to look at the Humanitarian Charter, which has these two core principles. The first one's the humanitarian imperative, which is action should be taken to prevent or alleviate human suffering arising out of disaster or conflict, and nothing should override this principle. That's underpinned by the humanity principle. The humanity principle says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, this humanity principle, of course, resonates with disability inclusion, with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. What happens in practice is the humanitarian imperative to act to deliver aid as quickly as possible often overrides the humanity principle. And the explanation that we have is that we need to deliver humanitarian aid to as many people as possible at the lowest unit cost. Any adaptation to a shelter, for example, a temporary shelter, that increases that unit cost reduces the number of overall beneficiaries. In a competitive funding environment where you are judged on your overall number of beneficiaries, there's a constraint, there's a challenge for humanitarian practitioners to actually implement that. So what we find is there's a disconnect between the disability stakeholder guidance and the operational realities of humanitarian shelter professionals. It doesn't really seem right to be advising people within the global shelter cluster who, remember, all have an architecture, or most at least, have an architecture or engineering background on universal design. They get that. That's not the overriding barrier they're facing. So this, if you like, was our starting point. And then as we look into the shelter sector itself, we have this high-level generic guidance on disability inclusion, but then that's being delivered to people that work in increasingly specialized sectors and subsectors. So, for example, we have non-food item distributions, emergency shelter, host assistance with host families, urban planning and zoning. There's a huge range of activities. Just to note, the one thing that is not here is evacuation centres. Okay? The global shelter cluster does not have responsibility for evacuation shelters. So that was also something that came up. Where a lot of people with disability that we were speaking to were really, that was a core focus for them, but those are generally fall under government or other arrangements. So what we're finding is these increasingly specialized sectors within the humanitarian sector and the shelter sector in particular, with multiple and diverse entry points. So where's it best to target our attention to get good and positive change? And we asked people where they felt would be what would require the least effort to improve disability inclusion as an entry point for improving the use of disability data. And what people said was agency-led repairs and upgrades. I'm not aware of any disability inclusion guidance that targets agency-led repairs and upgrades. The second one we asked them was, well, where's the potential within shelter assistance options to maximize the positive impacts for people with disability? Again, agency-led repairs came up, but also rental assistance. Conditional cash program, where there has been quite a bit of work. It's an emerging area. And also settlement planning. So the final point really is that we need to now really move towards tailored and specific guidance on disability data. We need to really be working with shelter professionals, getting down into the nitty-gritty of where they have needs and how we can use data to improve decision-making within those processes. In terms of a sort of crude summary, you could say, you could group together, why are we collecting disability data anyway? The first one is to identify people with disability, of course, and we want to improve participation within programming. And to link back to the Washington Group questions at the beginning, the Washington Group questions are great for this. They're probably the best tool that we have to actually do that at the moment. They avoid stigma, they can be used by the non-specialist, so really good. But we also need to identify needs. And it's by identifying needs that we know how best to adapt programs, to make decisions about resources and where they should be allocated. Now, the Washington Group questions alone don't tell us anything about needs. So there's a real gap there in terms of the available tools that we have to use within shelter response and humanitarian response in general. And finally, if we think about measurement of impact, to understand the extent of equality between people with and without disability, we can use the Washington Group questions. They were designed to disaggregate these large data sets, assuming that you have those large data sets to disaggregate in the first place, and they don't tell us anything about quality either. So, last slide. Looking ahead, we had really strong consensus from participants that what was needed was more advanced training on disability data for shelter professionals. Remember, this is coming from the perspective of shelter professionals. They also said that OPDs needed more advanced training. Why would the shelter professionals say that? What they're saying is the advice that we're getting from OPDs doesn't quite fit. What we do need is certainly more dialogue between the two. And when we asked them where they felt there was most influence, it wasn't at the global shelter cluster level. They were quite clear. We don't have that level of influence to create positive change. It's at the national level, it's at the sub-national level, it's with government, it's with in-country shelter clusters. There's also this need to widen data collection options, and particularly, as I said, on identifying and understanding needs, because that's where we can adapt programs more efficiently and to result in better equity and inclusion. We also really need to raise understandings on the strengths and limitations of currently available tools, and a lot more attention needs to be placed on process-based data. By that I mean measuring inclusion, what we do to ensure inclusion, because that's an area where we really do have a bit of a gap. And this is not to excuse the shelter sector. They could certainly do a lot more, but this is to present some of the findings where they are coming from in this debate, or discussion, I should say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And I'm just checking, Saba, Prabani and Viktoria, you're still online for question time? Fantastic. I'm happy to open the floor for questions now, and we've got someone who can bring you a microphone, so just put your hand up. You'll also know that we've got international sign language interpretation happening down the front, so if you could just make sure that you introduce yourself, who you are, and let me know who you want to direct the question to, or if it's a general question. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I meant there's a number of different, there's Indonesian, there's Fiji, there's a number of different sign languages interpretation going on down here. Sorry about that. I won't put another thing on. I won't add anything else onto you. But just acknowledging that there's a number of different sign languages going on down here. So clarity with your question would be great. So yeah, who would like to go first?
Hi, my name is Beth Sprunt. Thank you very much, everyone. That was a wonderful series of presentations. My question is to our Indonesian colleagues. So again, thank you. Really fabulous work that you're doing and research that you're doing. So there's some interesting figures in Australia and out of the US related to the proportion of prisoners who have learning disabilities or cognitive types of disabilities, which are very unnoticed. So some of your examples spoke around physical disabilities and you know, those figures of disability caused by the, you know, the arrest. That's awful. But my question is, do you know what are the rates of prisoners who have cognitive types of disabilities or behavioural? Not only the rates, but the issues for them.
Okay. Thank you. I'll try to answer this. The biggest challenge, actually, what we have is actually on the data itself. So we don't have really, accurate data on how many inmates with disability based on the category. So what we have actually now is they just doing this manually, and what we have is actually on the total number itself. So I mentioned earlier, around 2,000, actually around 1,500 inmates with disability. So up to now, this is something that we would like to improve. So we are working with the DGC to classify, to categorize the inmates with disability and put them into the database so that we could actually have a kind of what we call reliable data for future program, basically. So that's now we are working with at the moment. So yeah, we don't have actually the specific data on that at the moment.
That's great to hear you working on.
Yeah, I would like to add some information. We just launched online database system, but it's still improving. So maybe 2 until 3 months we will get data, classified data, and we are using also Washington indicator to be put in our online the database system. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. So, I'm from Indonesia. I want to ask to, but before I ask, I want to saying thank you for you all because all your presentations was good. So my organization, Indonesian Association of Women with Disabilities, already made MOU with the police in Indonesia about with the Barreskrim about how they make accessible services for people with disabilities in Indonesia. And also, the information should be accessible for deaf people using sign language, Indonesian Sign Language. And it is a long way to advocate for them, but it's still improving. And I really want to ask to Alex about disaster reduction, risk reduction, about Cianjur. Maybe you heard about the earthquake in Cianjur in West Java that happening this month. And a lot of a lot of people with disabilities coming to Cianjur to help the victim of the disaster. But before, they already trained to help others, and they are disabled. But the problem is the bureaucracy only only with the one bodies in Indonesia, and also about data, secondary data. It's not, it's limited, but it's already segregated based on gender. Now, our friend is currently verified the data about what the disabled people in Cianjur needs, and also about specialized needs up to women with disabilities there. Okay, and also we also trying to get the accessible clean water for people with disabilities there. We try to have 2 machines for clean water there. And I really keen to know how to get through the bureaucracy system that's very hard to break through in Indonesia. Maybe you have any tips about that, and maybe you can help people with disabilities to get their needs to be fulfilled. Because a lot of people with disabilities and various diverse disabilities, and also people with disabilities, you have to you have to remember about people with disabilities. You have to involve them in any programs, and also consultate with people with disabilities also, and don't forget about sign language interpreters. Thank you.
Great, Alex. A few things there for you, including how we can make sure people who are involved in responding to disasters are people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you, Buelvi. I'll try and answer your question in a minute, but you know, the first thing I think is important to recognize is that there's been a lot of work that's been done in Indonesia, and that's by the non-government sector, but also by BNPB, who have included people with disability in their training programs as well, which is a really important initiative by the government. And I think really post Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami, probably there was a bit of, as far as I'm aware, there was a bit of a turning point where we had a lot of Indonesian OPDs that were directly involved in the response. So I think there's a really large amount of capacity coming out of the disability community in Indonesia to respond in these terrible situations. And I just have to say, what was, a relatively small earthquake, that message again, that earthquakes do not kill people, buildings do. And, it feels that we've got such a long way to go in Indonesia, and we're kind of repeating that same thing. Now, in terms of coordination, wow. Look, I think one of the important things, and this is not probably a very satisfactory answer, but I think having OPDs that are now experienced of engaging with government and engaging with non-government stakeholders and other civil society in response is a huge strength. So I'm hoping that it's some of those people that were involved in Sulawesi are also involved in Cianjur. And if they're not, get in touch with them, talk about their experiences and what worked. there is, of course, the internal shelter clusters or cluster system within Indonesia. I'm not sure if that's operational in Chandra at the moment, but I really hope that OPDs are going to the local disaster management agencies, BPPD, and really directly engaging. Coordination is really difficult at the best of times, and Indonesia has a particularly complex administrative system as well. Sorry, not a very good answer.
A question at the back, Ben?
Thank you. My name's Ben, returned Australian volunteer from Kiribati. My question's for Mohamad and Echo, just in relation to how the government responds to your work. Are they open to it? Is there pushback? I would imagine some of these issues are very sensitive topics, and how you engage collaboratively and constructively with stakeholders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I have a privilege because I come from the university. So because of my center under the university, so Indonesian government tend to be open to accept our working. I think it is important in Indonesia because after Reformation's era is still how to say, suspicious from the state to non-governmental organizations. So when coming from the universities, not usually, but actually to some extent we have a privilege because university seen as neutral institutions. So we have a challenge, but so far is can be solved.
I just want to add a few things on that. We actually, this work actually, we try to find the champion first, basically. And fortunately, as I mentioned in the presentation, we found a good leader at that time. She was the first woman as the Director General. And then she is really passionate to reform. So we kind of approached her and kind of giving a menu list, basically. Okay, this is something that you can actually do to reform your organization, and she's really passionate to that. And fortunately, because of that, like she's like leading the process, and with the disability law as a game changer in our country, and it makes a lot easier for us to promote this issue. However, the biggest challenge actually on the budgetary side. Because, well, DGC, the Director General of Cohesion, has limited fund compared to other organizations. So they are really struggle in terms of finding the budget for sustainability purpose. That's why we try to, work like a small scale first, and then make it work, and then, we can actually then elevate to the national level and then convince the government to fund the future program. That's why our program start with very small, simple thing, like basically the establishment of the disability unit services in each of this prison. And if that works, then the government will be able to allocate more funding to that initiative. Thank you.
It's 12:28. I know we're all getting hungry. So one more quick question. Oh. Yeah. All right. Sally, are you happy to... Ben? Will's just come... Liam's coming down with the mic.
Hi, Ben.
There was no favouritism here.
It's a very quick one. Thanks, everyone, for your amazing presentations. I really enjoyed them. Just a quick question for Alex about data, disability data, and how it matters. A lot of governments around the world tell us that they don't have adequate data on disability, and often it's used as an excuse not to provide services and fund services and so forth. What do you think is really holding governments back from having this data? We've got Washington Group questions now, we've got lots of different ways of gathering data. What do you think is the holdback? Is it the systems? Is it funding? What do you think it is?
Sorry, I was going to...
Oh, it's great. Cheers.
Wow, I'm getting all the good questions, eh? Thanks, Ben. Look, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think many of us in the room share the frustration. You know, we're 20 years on from having pretty much the Washington Group questions. There are more countries that are using the Washington Group question, particularly in the Pacific, but we still don't have many disability monographs using the census data, for example. So, you know, collecting the data is one thing, but then using it to actually come up with some meaningful, you know, and impactful changes is a completely different issue. Again, coordination between government is one issue. I think one thing is that obviously the Washington Group tends to focus on national statistical organisations. And often they're not the ones that really have the power to collect data unless it's requested by other ministries. So you have to really have this kind of linked up approach to disability data, and it varies from country to country. I'm going to suggest that you talk to Beth, actually, in the lunchtime as well. But.
That's great information. And for those of you who recently did the Australian census, the Washington Group questions were in there in some form or shape. So you probably didn't even notice that they were there. I'd like to thank everyone, especially our panel members online. You know, you've been fantastic. I know it can be really hard when you come in online virtually. So thank you so much for your being here today. We've all really appreciated it. And to our panellists as well out the front here, a big round of applause. Thank you, everyone. Go and enjoy lunch.